When veteran English teacher Margaret Daniels found a yellowed envelope wedged behind a loose brick in the old library wall during renovations, she almost threw it away with the other debris. But when she noticed the careful handwriting that read, "For whoever finds this, the truth about what happened to us," and saw the date scrawled in the corner, October 15th, 1979, her 32 years of teaching experience told her this was something extraordinary. What she was about to uncover would finally solve the mystery that had haunted Riverside County for 4 decades and reveal the shocking truth about 5 children who simply vanished without a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're ready to discover what really happened to those 5 missing children. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because this is one mystery you won't want to miss. Margaret Daniels adjusted her reading glasses as she surveyed the chaos surrounding her in what had once been Millbrook Elementary School's beloved library. At 68 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and laugh lines etched deep around her green eyes, Margaret embodied the stereotype of a dedicated educator who had devoted her entire adult life to shaping young minds. She had taught at Millbrook for over 3 decades, watching generations of children pass through these halls, but today marked the end of an era. The old building was finally being demolished to make way for a modern facility, and Margaret had volunteered to help salvage any books or materials worth keeping before the wrecking ball arrived. The October morning air was crisp as it filtered through the broken windows, carrying with it the scent of falling leaves and the distant sound of construction equipment warming up in the parking lot. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that streamed across rows of empty bookshelves, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the space that had once buzzed with the whispered conversations of students and the gentle rustle of turning pages. Margaret found herself moving slowly through the room, not just because of the debris scattered across the floor, but because every corner held memories of the countless hours she had spent here with her students, fostering their love of literature and learning. The renovation crew had been systematically removing fixtures and tearing down non-load-bearing walls for the past week, and Margaret had made it her personal mission to ensure that nothing of historical or educational value was lost in the process. She had already rescued several boxes of classic novels, outdated but charming encyclopedias, and a collection of handwritten student poems from the 1980s that she simply couldn't bear to see destroyed. Her small Honda Civic was already packed to the brim with literary treasures, but she couldn't resist making one final sweep of the building before saying goodbye forever. As she made her way toward the section where the reference desk had once stood, Margaret noticed that the demolition crew had been particularly aggressive in this area. Chunks of plaster and broken wood littered the floor, and several bricks from the interior wall had been loosened or removed entirely. The wall itself had been part of the original 1960s construction, built with thick red bricks that had given the library its warm, cozy atmosphere. Now, with many of those bricks displaced, the wall looked like a mouth with missing teeth, revealing dark gaps that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Margaret carefully stepped over a pile of debris, testing each footstep to ensure the floor was stable beneath her sensible teaching shoes. She had dressed practically for this salvage mission, wearing old jeans and a faded sweater that she wouldn't mind getting dirty, but she still moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades navigating classrooms full of energetic children. As she reached the damaged wall, something caught her eye in one of the larger gaps where 3 bricks had been removed in a neat row. There, wedged deep in the space behind the wall, was what appeared to be an envelope. It was yellowed with age and covered in a fine layer of dust and spider webs, but it was clearly deliberate placement rather than accidental debris. Margaret's curiosity was immediately piqued. In her experience, children were notorious for hiding things in creative places, and over the years she had discovered everything from love notes to candy stashes tucked away in the most unexpected locations throughout the school. But this hiding spot seemed different, more purposeful and permanent than a typical childhood secret. She reached carefully into the gap, her fingers brushing against the rough interior brick and decades of accumulated dust. The envelope was wedged quite firmly in place, as if whoever had put it there had intended for it to stay hidden for a very long time. Margaret had to work her fingers around the edges, gently coaxing it free without tearing the aged paper. When she finally managed to extract it, she was surprised by how substantial it felt in her hands. This wasn't a single sheet of paper folded into an envelope, but something thicker, more significant. The envelope itself was clearly old, made of the kind of heavy cream-colored paper that schools had used for official correspondence back in the 1970s and early 1980s. The corners were slightly rounded with age, and there were small brown spots scattered across the surface that spoke of decades spent in darkness and humidity. But what immediately captured Margaret's attention was the handwriting on the front. Written in careful blue ink, in the precise, cursive script that teachers had once insisted all students master, were the words, "For whoever finds this, the truth about what happened to us." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she read those words. Something about the formality of the language, combined with the obvious age of the envelope, suggested that this wasn't a childhood prank or a forgotten homework assignment. The phrase "what happened to us" implied multiple people, and the word "truth" suggested that whatever was inside might reveal something important, something that had been deliberately hidden from the world for decades. She turned the envelope over, in her hands, looking for additional clues about its origin. On the back flap, written in the same careful handwriting but slightly smaller, was a date that made her breath catch in her throat. October 15th, 1979. Margaret's mind immediately began racing as she tried to place the significance of that date. 40 years ago would have been during her first few years of teaching, when she was still young and idealistic, fresh out of college with dreams of changing the world one student at a time. But October 1979 held a particular significance in the history of Riverside County that went far beyond Margaret's personal timeline. It was the month when 5 children from Millbrook Elementary had simply vanished without a trace, sparking the largest missing persons investigation in the county's history and leaving a scar on the community that had never fully healed. Margaret remembered the case well, not just because she had been teaching at the time, but because the disappearance of those 5 children had fundamentally changed how schools operated, how parents supervised their children, and how the entire community thought about safety and trust. The missing children had been typical elementary school students, ranging in age from 7 to 10 years old. There had been Tommy Rodriguez, a freckle-faced third grader who loved baseball and had dreams of playing for the Yankees. Sarah Chen, a quiet but brilliant second grader who was already reading at a high school level. Marcus Williams, a fourth grader with an infectious laugh who could make friends with anyone. Lisa Murphy, a artistic 7-year-old who spent every recess drawing elaborate fairy tale scenes. And finally, David Patterson, a 10-year-old fifth grader who served as the group's unofficial leader and was known for his protective nature toward younger students. According to the police reports that had been extensively covered in the local newspaper, all 5 children had been present for the full school day on October 15, 1979. Their teachers had marked them present for every class. They had eaten lunch in the cafeteria, and they had been accounted for during the final attendance. Check before dismissal. But somewhere between the time the school buses left the parking lot and when their parents expected them home, all 5 children had simply disappeared. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no bodies ever found. They had quite literally vanished into thin air, leaving behind devastated families and a community consumed by fear and suspicion. The investigation had consumed local law enforcement for months. Federal agents had been called in, search parties had combed every inch of the surrounding countryside, and suspicious individuals had been questioned and re-questioned. Tips and supposed sightings had poured in from across the country, each one carefully investigated and ultimately leading nowhere. The case had remained active for years, then decades, but as time passed and leads grew cold, It had gradually faded from active investigation status to become one of those unsolved mysteries that small communities never quite forget. Margaret had vivid memories of the fear and paranoia that had gripped Millbrook Elementary in the weeks and months following the disappearance. Parents had become protective to the point of paranoia, no longer allowing their children to walk to school alone or play outside unsupervised. Teachers had been required to implement new safety protocols, including detailed attendance tracking and supervised dismissal procedures that ensured every child was accounted for before leaving school. Property? The carefree atmosphere that had once characterized childhood in their small town had been replaced by a constant undercurrent of anxiety and suspicion. Now, 40 years later, Margaret found herself holding what might be the key to finally understanding what had really happened to those 5 innocent children. Her hands trembled slightly as she considered the implications. If this envelope truly contained information about their disappearance, it could finally provide the answers that families had been seeking for 4 decades. It could bring closure to parents who had spent their entire lives wondering whether their children were alive or dead, suffering or at peace. But Margaret also understood that opening this envelope would likely change everything. If it contained evidence of a crime, she would have a moral and legal obligation to contact the authorities. If it revealed information that implicated someone in the community, it could destroy relationships and reputations that had been built over decades. If it contained details about the children's fate, it might finally end the hoping and wondering that had kept some families going through the darkest periods of their lives. Standing alone in the dusty, partially demolished library, with the mysterious envelope in her hands, Margaret felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about satisfying her own curiosity or solving a historical mystery. This was about 5 children who had been somebody's babies, somebody's pride and joy, somebody's reason for living. This was about families who had never stopped, hoping for answers and a community that had never quite healed from the trauma of their loss. Margaret carefully slipped the envelope into her purse, knowing that she needed time and privacy to properly consider what to do next. Whatever secrets it contained had waited 40 years to be discovered, and they could wait a few more hours while she decided on the most responsible course of action. But as she made her way carefully back through the debris toward the exit, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was going to change everything, not just for her, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the mystery of the 5 missing children of Millbrook Elementary. Part 2. Character Introduction. Margaret Daniels had always been the kind of teacher who noticed everything. During her 32 years at Millbrook Elementary, she had developed what colleagues jokingly called teacher radar, an uncanny ability to spot trouble brewing before it erupted, to identify the quiet child who needed extra attention, and to detect when something was amiss in her carefully ordered classroom world. It was this same intuitive awareness that had made her one of the most respected educators in Riverside County, earning her the Teacher of the Year award 3 times and the deep affection of literally thousands of former students who still sent her holiday cards decades after graduating. Born Margaret Louise Fitzgerald in 1951, she had grown up in the very community where she would eventually dedicate her professional life. Her father had been the town's only pharmacist, running Fitzgerald's drugstore on Main Street with the kind of personal service that made him a trusted confidant to half the residents of their small town. Her mother had been a librarian at the county library system, instilling in Margaret a deep love of literature and learning that would shape her entire career path. From childhood, Margaret had been surrounded by books, stories, and the quiet satisfaction that came from helping others access knowledge and understanding. The decision to become a teacher had never really been a decision at all, but rather a natural evolution of her personality and values. Even as a young girl, Margaret had been the one organizing neighborhood children into elaborate educational games, setting up pretend schools in her backyard, and patiently helping struggling classmates with their homework. Her patient nature, combined with a genuine enthusiasm for learning, and an instinctive understanding of how children's minds worked had made teaching seem like the only logical career choice. Margaret had graduated from the local state university in 1973 with a degree in elementary education and a minor in English literature. She had student-taught at 3 different schools in the district, but Millbrook Elementary had felt like home from the moment she walked through its doors. The building itself was relatively new then, having been constructed in the early 1960s to accommodate the growing population of young families moving to Riverside County. With its brick exterior, large windows, and modern amenities, it represented everything progressive and hopeful about education in America during that era. When she was hired as a full-time teacher in the fall of 1974, Margaret had been assigned to teach 3rd grade, a placement that suited her perfectly. 3rd graders were old enough to engage in meaningful conversations and complex learning activities, but young enough to still retain that natural curiosity and enthusiasm that made teaching such a joy. They were at the perfect age to be molded and influenced, to develop study habits and social skills that would serve them throughout their academic careers. Margaret's classroom had quickly become known throughout the school as a place where magic happened. She had a gift for making even the most mundane subjects come alive through creative storytelling, hands-on activities, and her infectious enthusiasm for learning. Her bulletin boards were always meticulously decorated with student work and educational displays that changed seasonally, creating an environment that was both stimulating and welcoming. She invested her own money in classroom supplies, books, and small rewards that helped motivate her students to achieve their best. But beyond her pedagogical skills, Margaret possessed something even more valuable: an intuitive understanding of children that allowed her to see past behavior to underlying needs and emotions. She could spot a child who was struggling at home just by observing subtle changes in their classroom demeanor. She recognized the signs of learning disabilities before they became academic failures, and she had an uncanny ability to identify social dynamics that might lead to bullying or exclusion before they escalated into serious problems. This heightened awareness extended beyond her own classroom to the entire school community. Margaret made it her business to know every child in the building by name, to understand the family dynamics that might affect their academic performance, and to maintain relationships with parents that went beyond the standard twice-yearly conferences. She attended every school function, volunteered for countless committees, and often stayed after hours to provide extra help to struggling students or to collaborate with colleagues on curriculum development. The year 1979 had marked Margaret's 5th year of teaching, a time when she was hitting her stride professionally, but still retained the idealism and energy of a relatively new educator. She had been 28 years old that October, recently married to Margaret Daniels, a local contractor who shared her love of community involvement and quiet family life. They had been trying to start a family of their own, though that dream wouldn't be realized until several years later when they welcomed their daughter Jennifer in 1983. During those early years of her career, Margaret had developed particularly close relationships with many of her students and their families. The community was smaller then, more tightly knit, and teachers were considered integral parts of the social fabric. Margaret knew which children came from single-parent homes, which families were struggling financially, and which students needed extra encouragement to build their self-confidence. This deep knowledge of her students' lives made the events of October 15, 1979, particularly devastating for her. Margaret remembered that day with crystalline clarity, even 40 years later. It had been a beautiful autumn morning, with crisp air and brilliant foliage creating the perfect backdrop for outdoor activities. She had planned a nature walk for her 3rd grade class, during which students would collect leaves for a science project about seasonal changes. The 5 children who would later disappear had all been in different grade levels, so Margaret hadn't taught any of them directly, but she knew them all by sight and reputation. Tommy Rodriguez had been in Mrs. Peterson's 3rd grade class, the section parallel to Margaret's own. She remembered him as an energetic boy with an infectious smile who was always the first to volunteer for playground cleanup duty. Sarah Chen had been in Miss Bradley's second-grade class, a quiet child who spent most recesses reading in the library rather than playing outside with her peers. Marcus Williams had been one of Mrs. Thompson's fourth-graders, known throughout the school for his kind nature and willingness to help younger students with their lunch trays or playground conflicts. Lisa Murphy had been in Mr. Garcia's second-grade class, a creative soul who covered every assignment with elaborate doodles and decorative borders that demonstrated remarkable artistic talent for such a young child. And David Patterson had been in Mrs. Wilson's fifth-grade class, a natural leader who served on the student council and was respected by children across all grade levels for his fairness and maturity. On that fateful day, Margaret had completed her nature walk successfully, bringing her students back to the classroom energized and excited about their leaf collections. She had supervised the normal dismissal routine, ensuring that each child in her care was accounted for as they boarded buses or met their parents for pickup. Everything had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly routine, perfectly safe. It wasn't, until the following morning that the horrible truth began to emerge. Phone calls started coming into the school office around 7:30, as parents reported that their children had never made it home the previous afternoon. At first, there was confusion and uncertainty. Perhaps there had been a miscommunication about after-school activities, or maybe the children had stopped to play at a friend's house without permission. But as more calls came in, and as it became clear that all 5 missing children had last been seen at school, the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. Margaret remembered the sick feeling that had settled in her stomach as she realized that 5 of her school's children had simply vanished. As someone who prided herself on knowing every detail of what happened within the school building, she felt a profound sense of responsibility and helplessness. How could 5 children disappear without anyone noticing? How could the safety systems that schools had in place have failed so completely? The days and weeks that followed had been a nightmare of police interviews, media attention, and community meetings. Margaret had been questioned extensively about her observations from October 15th, about whether she had noticed anything unusual in the children's behavior or in the presence of strangers around the school. She had racked her brain trying to remember every detail from that day, but nothing had stood out as suspicious or concerning. The investigation had consumed the entire school community. Teachers, administrators, and support staff had all been interviewed multiple times. Parents had been questioned about their children's friends, activities, and any concerns they might have had about potential threats. Students had been gently asked about their interactions with the missing children and whether they had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the disappearance. Margaret had thrown herself into supporting the affected families and helping the school community cope with the trauma and uncertainty. She had organized meal trains for the families, coordinated counseling services for students who were struggling with fear and anxiety, and worked with administrators to develop new safety protocols that might prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. But despite all the official investigation, all the community support, and all the media attention, the case had gradually grown cold. Years passed without any credible leads or significant developments. The missing children's families held on to hope for as long as they could, but eventually most had moved away from the community, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Margaret, however, had stayed. She had continued teaching at Millbrook Elementary, watching new generations of students pass through the halls where Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, Lisa, and David had once learned and played. She had never forgotten those 5 children, carrying their memory with her through every school year, every lesson plan, every interaction with new students who reminded her of the ones who had been lost. Now, as she sat in her car in the parking lot of the school that was about to be demolished, Margaret felt the weight of those 40 years of wondering and worrying. The envelope in her purse seemed to pulse with possibility, offering the chance for answers that she had never expected to receive. Her hands shook slightly as she started the engine, knowing that whatever information that envelope contained would change not just her understanding of the past, but potentially the lives of everyone who had been touched by the mystery of those 5 missing children. Part 3. The initial red flag. Margaret drove home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood with the mysterious envelope weighing heavily in her purse beside her. The October afternoon had grown overcast, and the cheerful autumn colors that had brightened her morning now seemed muted and somber under the gray sky. Her modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street looked exactly as she had left it that morning, with its neat flower beds and freshly painted white shutters. But something felt different now. The normalcy of her surroundings seemed almost surreal given the potential significance of what she had discovered. Robert's pickup truck was already in the driveway, which meant he had finished his construction job early and would likely be expecting to hear about her final day at the old school building. At 71, her husband of 45 years had officially retired from his contracting business 3 years earlier, though he still took on small projects for longtime clients who trusted his craftsmanship. Margaret knew he would be curious about what treasures she had managed to salvage from the demolition, and she wasn't sure how to explain the envelope without revealing the turmoil it had created in her mind. She sat in her car for several minutes. After turning off the engine, staring at her purse and wrestling with the decision of whether to open the envelope immediately or wait until she had more time to process whatever she might find inside. The rational part of her mind argued for patience and careful consideration. If the envelope truly contained information about the missing children, it deserved to be handled with the utmost care and respect. But another part of her, the part that had spent 40 years wondering about those 5 lost souls, was screaming with curiosity and desperate hope for answers. Margaret finally gathered her resolve and walked into the house, where she found Robert in his favorite armchair, reading the evening newspaper. He looked up with a warm smile that had barely changed since their college days, though his thick brown hair had long since turned silver and deep lines now mapped the years of outdoor work around his kind blue eyes. The familiar comfort of their home, with its well-worn furniture and walls covered with family photos and mementos from decades of teaching, usually provided Margaret with a sense of peace and stability. Today, however, even these beloved surroundings felt somehow foreign and distant. "How did the final salvage mission go?" Robert asked, folding his newspaper and giving her his full attention. "Did you manage to rescue any more literary treasures from the wrecking ball?" Margaret forced a smile and began unpacking the boxes of books she had loaded into her car that morning, describing the various items she had saved while carefully avoiding any mention of the envelope. She told him about finding a complete set of Nancy Drew mysteries from the 1970s, a collection of student poetry anthologies, and several boxes of classic novels that she planned to donate to the new school library. But as she spoke, she could feel the weight of the hidden envelope in her purse, and she found it increasingly difficult to maintain normal conversation. Robert, who had learned to read his wife's moods with the precision that came from decades of marriage, noticed her distraction almost immediately. "You seem a little unsettled tonight," he observed gently. "Was it more emotional than you expected, saying goodbye to the old building?" The question gave Margaret an opening to share at least part of what was troubling her without revealing the full truth. "It was harder than I thought it would be," she admitted, settling onto the couch beside his chair. "So many memories in that building, so many children who passed through those halls. I kept thinking about all the students I taught there over the years, including—" She paused, unsure how much to reveal. "Including those 5 children who disappeared in 1979. Robert's expression grew more serious at the mention of the missing children. He had lived through that traumatic time alongside Margaret, watching his young wife struggle with the guilt and helplessness that all the teachers had felt in the aftermath of the disappearance. He had held her while she cried over the unfairness of it all, had listened to her endless speculation about what might have happened, and had seen how the unsolved case had affected her approach to teaching for years afterward. "I can imagine that being in the building one last time would bring back a lot of difficult memories," Robert said softly. "That case affected you more than most people realized at the time." Margaret nodded, grateful for his understanding, but still struggling with how much to share. I found myself thinking about them a lot today, wondering what they would have become, what their lives might have been like if... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought that had haunted her for 4 decades. After dinner, Margaret excused herself to take a bath, claiming that the dusty work at the school had left her feeling grimy and tired. In reality, she needed privacy to examine the envelope more carefully and decide on her next course of action. She locked the bathroom door and sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding the aged envelope under the bright vanity lights for the first time since discovering it. In the clear light, she could see additional details that she had missed in the dim library. The handwriting was definitely that of a child, but an older child with excellent penmanship training. The letters were formed with the careful precision that suggested someone who had been taught proper cursive technique and took pride in their writing. The ink had faded from blue to a grayish color over the decades, but it was still clearly legible. More intriguingly, Margaret noticed that there were actually 2 different sets of handwriting on the envelope. The main message, "For whoever finds." This, the truth about what happened to us, was written in one hand, but the date October 15, 1979, appeared to be written by someone else entirely. The second handwriting was slightly smaller and more hurried, as if it had been added quickly as an afterthought or clarification. Margaret turned the envelope over and examined the back flap more carefully. It had been sealed with what appeared to be standard school glue, the kind that children used for art projects, rather than the moisture-activated adhesive that came on most envelopes. The seal had loosened slightly over the decades, and she could see that the envelope contained multiple sheets of paper, some of which appeared to be different colors or textures. As she held the envelope up to the light, Margaret could make out what appeared to be writing on the papers inside, but she couldn't decipher any specific words or details. The thickness of the envelope suggested that it contained quite a bit of material, perhaps several letters, or a longer narrative, or maybe even drawings or other documents that the children had considered important enough to hide. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Margaret as she considered her options. Every instinct she possessed as a teacher and as a human being told her that this envelope contained something significant, something that could potentially change the lives of multiple families who had spent 40 years in limbo. But she also understood that opening it would cross a line from which there could be no return. Once she knew what was inside, she would be obligated to act on that knowledge, regardless of the consequences. Margaret thought about the families of the missing children, most of whom had eventually moved away from the community after years of fruitless hoping and waiting. Tommy Rodriguez's parents had divorced within 2 years of his disappearance, unable to cope with their grief and the strain of constant uncertainty. Sarah Chen's mother had suffered a nervous breakdown and had been institutionalized for several months before eventually relocating to another state to live with relatives. Marcus Williams's grandmother, who had been raising him after his parents died in a car accident, had passed away just 5 years after his disappearance, taking her heartbreak to the grave. Lisa Murphy's parents had perhaps suffered the most, visibly, spending their life savings on private investigators and psychics, chasing every lead and following up on every supposed sighting across the country. They had appeared on television programs and in newspaper articles, pleading for information and keeping their daughter's case in the public eye for as long as possible. Margaret had lost touch with them over the years, but she believed they had eventually moved to California, still hoping against hope that their daughter might someday contact them. David Patterson's family had taken a different approach, establishing a foundation in his name that worked to improve child safety and support families of missing children. His parents had channeled their grief into activism, lobbying for changes in how schools handled student supervision and how law enforcement responded to missing person cases involving children. Margaret had followed their work over the years, admiring their ability to transform their personal tragedy into a force for positive change. But regardless of how each family had coped with their loss, Margaret knew that all of them deserved answers if those answers existed. The envelope in her hands might contain nothing more than childhood fantasies or innocent games, but it might also hold the key to solving a mystery that had tormented an entire community for decades. As Margaret sat in her bathroom, holding the envelope that had waited 40 years to be discovered, she found herself thinking about the children themselves rather than their families. Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, Lisa, and David had been real people with real dreams and fears and hopes for the future. They had been someone's classmates, someone's friends, someone's cherished children. If they had hidden this envelope, they had done so for a reason, and that reason deserved to be honored and respected. The envelope seemed to grow heavier in her hands as Margaret realized that she couldn't simply ignore what she had found. Whether it contained earth-shattering revelations or innocent childhood secrets, it represented the voices of 5 children who had been silenced far too soon. She owed it to them, to their families, and to her own conscience to discover what they had wanted the world to know. Margaret carefully placed the envelope in her jewelry box between 2 velvet-lined compartments where it would be safe from Robert's casual notice. She needed more time to prepare herself mentally and emotionally for whatever she might discover, and she wanted to be in the right frame of mind when she finally broke the seal that had protected those secrets for 4 decades. Tomorrow, she decided she would find the courage to open it and learn the truth about what had happened to the 5 missing children of Millbrook Elementary. Margaret slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with shadowy images of children calling out from dark places she couldn't reach. She woke several times, her heart racing from nightmares she couldn't quite remember, but each time her thoughts immediately turned to the envelope hidden in her jewelry box. By 5 in the morning, she gave up any pretense of sleep and made her way quietly to the kitchen, where she sat with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise through her kitchen window, painting the October sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the artwork Lisa Murphy used to create during those long-ago art classes. Robert found her there 2 hours later, still in her bathrobe and staring out at their backyard where the maple trees were dropping their leaves in a steady, melancholy dance. He could tell immediately that something was seriously troubling his wife, but 45 years of marriage had taught him when to push for information and when to simply offer quiet support. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her at their small breakfast table, waiting for her to share whatever was weighing so heavily on her mind. "I keep thinking about those children," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. About what their last day at school must have been like, whether they were afraid, whether they knew what was going to happen to them. She paused, taking a shaky sip of coffee. "I was there that day, Robert. I saw them in the hallways, at lunch, during dismissal. They seemed perfectly normal, perfectly happy. How could 5 children just vanish without anyone noticing anything unusual?" Robert reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. "You've been carrying this guilt for 40 years, Maggie, and it's not yours to carry. You were a young teacher doing your job, and you did it well. What happened to those children wasn't something anyone could have prevented based on what anyone knew at the time." But Margaret shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the falling leaves outside. "That's just it, though. What if someone did know something? What if there were signs that everyone missed, or information that never came to light? What if the answer was there all along, and we just never found it?" She turned to look at her husband, and he could see a new intensity in her green eyes that he hadn't noticed the night before. What if those children tried to tell someone what was happening, but no one listened? The questions hung in the air between them like physical things, heavy with implications that Robert couldn't quite grasp. He could see that his wife was working towards something, building up to a revelation or decision that was causing her considerable anguish. But Margaret wasn't ready to share the full truth about the envelope yet. Not until she had examined its contents herself and understood what she was dealing with. After Robert left for his morning walk, a routine he had maintained religiously since his retirement, Margaret returned to their bedroom and retrieved the envelope from her jewelry box. In the morning light streaming through their bedroom window, it looked even more mysterious and significant than it had the day before. The careful handwriting seemed to call out to her, promising answers that she had never expected to find. Margaret carried the envelope to her home office, a small room that had once been their daughter Jennifer's bedroom but had been converted into Margaret's personal workspace after Jennifer moved out to start her own family. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing her collection of classic literature, educational resources, and professional development materials accumulated over 3 decades of teaching. Her desk was a solid oak piece that Robert had built for her as an anniversary gift, its surface usually neat and organized, but now cleared completely to accommodate what she was about to discover. She sat in her comfortable desk chair and placed the envelope in front of her, studying it one more time before committing to opening it. The morning sun slanted across the desk, illuminating the aged paper and making the faded ink seem to glow with an inner light. Margaret could feel her heart beating faster as she contemplated the magnitude of what she was about to do. Once she opened this envelope, there would be no going back to the comfortable uncertainty she had lived with for 4 decades. With trembling fingers, Margaret carefully worked at the loosened seal, trying to open the envelope without damaging its contents. The old glue gave way easily, and she was able to lift the flap without tearing the paper. Inside, just as she had suspected, were multiple sheets of paper in different colors and sizes. Some appeared to be standard notebook paper, while others looked like construction paper or art supplies that children might have access to in school. Margaret carefully extracted the papers and laid them out on her desk in the order they had been stacked in the envelope. There were 7 pieces total: 3 sheets of lined notebook paper covered with writing, 2 pieces of manila construction paper with what appeared to be hand-drawn maps or diagrams, 1 sheet of white drawing paper with a detailed sketch, and a small piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a spiral notebook. The first thing that struck Margaret was the variety of handwriting styles represented in the documents. She could immediately identify at least 3 different hands, suggesting that multiple children had contributed to whatever these papers contained. The writing ranged from the careful, precise cursive she had noticed on the envelope to a more hurried print that looked like it had been written quickly or under stress. Margaret began with the first sheet of notebook paper, which appeared to be the beginning of a longer narrative. The handwriting was neat and controlled, suggesting it had been written by an older child with good penmanship skills. At the top of the page, in the same careful cursive from the envelope, were the words, "What Really Happened," by David Patterson, October 15, 1979. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she read David's name. This was definitely written by one of the missing children, and the date confirmed that it had been created on the day of their disappearance. But how had David found time to write this on what must have been the most traumatic day of his young life? And how had he managed to hide it so carefully that it had remained undiscovered for 40 years? The narrative began with what appeared to be a straightforward account of the school day from David's perspective. He described attending his regular classes, eating lunch in the cafeteria, and participating in a math quiz that he felt confident he had passed. But as Margaret read further, subtle details began to emerge that painted a picture of growing unease and concern among the 5 children. According to David's account, the trouble had begun during the lunch period when Tommy Rodriguez had approached him with disturbing information. Tommy claimed that he had overheard a conversation between 2 adults near the school's loading dock, where delivery trucks normally dropped off supplies and cafeteria food. The conversation had been partially obscured by the noise of machinery, but Tommy was certain he had heard his own name mentioned, along with those of the other 4 children who would later disappear. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she read David's careful description of Tommy's report. The boy had apparently been frightened enough by what he overheard to seek out David, who was known throughout the school as a natural leader and problem solver. David had taken Tommy's concerns seriously and had decided to investigate further, enlisting the help of Sarah, Marcus, and Lisa to gather more information about the adults Tommy had seen. The narrative continued with David's account of how the 5 children had spent their afternoon recess conducting their own investigation. They had positioned themselves at various points around the school, where they could observe the loading dock and the surrounding areas without being noticed by teachers or other students. What they discovered, according to David's careful documentation, was evidence of what appeared to be a carefully planned operation involving multiple adults who clearly did not belong on school property. Margaret's hands began to shake as she read David's description of the adults the children had observed. There were at least 3 individuals, possibly 4, who had been moving around the school grounds with what David described as fake purpose, acting as if they belonged there while clearly being unfamiliar with normal school routines and procedures. The children had noticed that these adults were paying particular attention to dismissal procedures, carefully observing which children walked home, which ones rode buses, and which ones were picked up by parents. Even more disturbing was David's account of how these adults had somehow obtained detailed information about the 5 missing children specifically. According to his narrative, the children had overheard conversations that included not just their names, but details about their home addresses, family situations, and daily routines that suggested extensive prior surveillance and planning. Margaret realized that she was reading an eyewitness account of what appeared to be a kidnapping plot in progress, documented by the intended victims themselves. The children had somehow recognized the danger they were in and had taken the extraordinary step of creating a written record of what they had observed, perhaps hoping that it would be discovered if something happened to them. But the most chilling aspect of David's narrative was his description of how the children had tried to alert adults to the danger they perceived. According to his account, they had attempted to report their concerns to 3 different teachers and a school administrator, but their warnings had been dismissed as childhood imagination or attention-seeking behavior. The adults had apparently been so focused on maintaining normal school routines that they had failed to recognize the legitimacy of the children's fears. Margaret could hardly believe what she was reading. If David's account was accurate, the 5 children had essentially solved their own case before they disappeared, but no one had taken them seriously enough to investigate their claims or take protective action. The tragedy wasn't just that 5 children had been kidnapped, but that they had tried to prevent their own abduction and had been ignored by the very adults who were supposed to protect them. As she finished reading the first page of David's narrative, Margaret realized that this document represented far more than historical evidence of a 40-year-old crime. It was the indictment of the entire system that had failed to protect these children, and it raised devastating questions about how many warning signs had been missed or dismissed in the crucial hours before the disappearance. Margaret carefully set down the first page and reached for the second sheet of notebook paper, knowing that whatever she read next would likely be even more disturbing than what she had already discovered. The envelope had promised the truth about what happened to us, and she was beginning to understand that the truth was far more complex and heartbreaking than anyone had ever imagined. Margaret stared at the second page of David's narrative for several long minutes before finding the courage to continue reading. Her coffee had grown cold on the desk beside her, and she could hear the familiar sounds of Robert returning from his morning walk. But she felt completely disconnected from the normal rhythms of her daily life. The words on the page seemed to pulse with urgency, carrying the voices of children who had been silenced 4 decades ago, and she found herself struggling with the overwhelming responsibility of being the first person to hear their story. The second page of David's account detailed the children's growing desperation as they realized that their attempts to warn adults had failed completely. According to his careful documentation, they had approached Mrs. Henderson, the 3rd-grade teacher who supervised the playground during lunch recess, but she had dismissed their concerns as overactive imaginations after a brief conversation. They had then sought out Mr. Williams, the assistant principal, but he had been too busy dealing with a minor disciplinary issue to give them his full attention. Most heartbreakingly, David wrote that they had finally approached Mrs. Foster, the school counselor who was specifically trained to listen to children's concerns and take them seriously, but even she had apparently failed to recognize the legitimacy of their fears, suggesting instead that they were probably feeling anxious about an upcoming test or worried about some playground conflict that had gotten blown out of proportion, in their minds. Margaret felt sick as she read David's account of how the children had been systematically dismissed and ignored by every adult they had trusted with their concerns. As an educator herself, she understood how easy it would have been for busy teachers and administrators to misinterpret the children's warnings as typical childhood drama or attention-seeking behavior. But she also recognized the tragic irony of a system designed to protect children failing so completely when protection was most desperately needed. The narrative continued with David's description of the children's decision to take matters into their own hands. Realizing that they couldn't count on adult intervention, they had developed their own plan to document everything they had observed and hide the evidence where it might eventually be discovered if something happened to them. David had taken charge of writing the main narrative, while the other children had contributed drawings, maps, and additional observations that would provide a complete picture of the threat they faced. Margaret could see David's growing fear, reflected in his handwriting, which became less controlled and more hurried as the account progressed. He wrote about how the suspicious adults had begun to pay more direct attention to the 5 children during the afternoon, as if they had somehow realized that their activities were being observed and documented. The children had tried to act normally during their final classes of the day, but David described the terrible tension of knowing they were being watched while trying to maintain the pretense that everything was fine. The most chilling part of the second page was David's account of the children's final moments at school. According to his narrative, they had managed to hide their documentation in the library wall during a brief window when they were supposedly using the bathroom before dismissal. David had apparently chosen that location because he knew the library was being renovated and thought the hiding place might remain undisturbed for a long time, giving their evidence the best chance of eventual discovery. Margaret realized that she was holding not just historical evidence, but a deliberate message from 5 children who had somehow known they were in mortal danger and had taken extraordinary steps to ensure their story would eventually be told. The sophistication of their planning and documentation was remarkable for children so young, but it also spoke to the level of terror they must have experienced as they realized that the adults around them either couldn't or wouldn't protect them. As she set down the second page and reached for the third, Margaret found herself grappling with conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Part of her felt an overwhelming sense of pride in the courage and intelligence these children had shown in their final hours. They had recognized danger, attempted to seek help through proper channels, and when that failed, they had taken initiative to create a record that might someday bring their captors to justice. But another part of her felt crushing guilt and regret about the failures of the adult world that had left these children so completely on their own. As someone who had dedicated her entire career to protecting and nurturing young people, Margaret found it almost unbearable to imagine how abandoned and terrified David, Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, and Lisa must have felt as they realized that no one was going to save them. The third page of David's narrative was written in noticeably shakier handwriting, suggesting that it had been composed under extreme stress or in a hurried time frame. It began with a detailed description of the suspicious adults, including physical descriptions, clothing, and overheard fragments of conversation that the children had managed to collect during their surveillance activities. David had apparently instructed each of the other children to focus on different aspects of their observations, creating a comprehensive intelligence report that was remarkably thorough for amateur investigators of such young ages. Margaret was struck by the level of detail the children had managed to gather in such a short time. They had noted license plate numbers of unfamiliar vehicles parked near the school, descriptions of unusual equipment or tools the adults had been carrying, and even snippets of conversation that suggested the operation had been planned for weeks, or possibly months in advance. The children had somehow recognized that these details might be crucial for law enforcement investigation, and they had taken care to document everything as accurately as possible. But the most devastating part of the third page was David's final paragraph, written in handwriting so shaky it was almost illegible. He described how the children had realized during final dismissal that their worst fears were about to be confirmed. The suspicious adults had positioned themselves at strategic points around the school grounds, clearly preparing to intercept the 5 children before they could reach the safety of their homes or buses. David's final words were heartbreaking in their simple clarity. "If someone finds this, please tell our families that we tried to be smart and we tried to get help, but nobody would listen to us. We're going to try to stay together and take care of each other no matter what happens. We hope someone will look for us and find the bad people who took us. Please don't let them hurt other kids the way they're going to hurt us." Margaret found herself crying as she read those final sentences, overwhelmed by the combination of childish hope and mature understanding of their dire situation that David had expressed. These children had somehow maintained enough optimism to believe they might be rescued, while also demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the need to document their experience for the benefit of future investigations and potential victims. Setting down the 3rd page with trembling hands, Margaret reached for the manila construction paper that contained what appeared to be hand-drawn maps and diagrams. The first sheet showed a detailed layout of the school grounds, with specific locations marked where the children had observed suspicious activity. The drawing was remarkably accurate, suggesting that whoever had created it possessed both artistic skill and careful attention to detail. Various points on the map were marked with symbols and notations that corresponded to a legend drawn in the corner of the page. Margaret could see that the children had identified multiple observation posts, escape routes, and areas where the suspicious adults had been seen conducting what appeared to be surveillance activities. The level of strategic thinking reflected in the map was extraordinary for children of elementary school age, but it also spoke to their desperate recognition that their lives depended on careful planning and intelligent action. The second manila sheet contained what appeared to be timeline documentation, showing the progression of suspicious activities throughout the day. The children had apparently been conducting organized surveillance for several hours, carefully tracking the movements and activities of the adults they had identified as threats. The timeline showed a clear escalation of concerning behavior, culminating in the positioning of the adults at strategic points around the school during dismissal time. Margaret realized that she was looking at evidence that could potentially solve not just the disappearance of 5 children, but what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal operation that had been carried out with military-like precision and planning. The level of detail in the children's documentation suggested that law enforcement might still be able to identify and prosecute the perpetrators, even after 40 years, if any of them were still alive and if the evidence could be properly authenticated. But as she studied the children's careful work, Margaret also found herself grappling with profound questions about her own responsibility and the potential consequences of revealing what she had discovered. These documents represented evidence of crimes that had never been solved, but they also contained information that could potentially destroy lives, reopen old wounds, and create new forms of suffering for families who had spent decades trying to heal from their losses. Margaret knew that she couldn't simply ignore what she had found, but she also understood that revealing it would set in motion a chain of events that she couldn't control or predict. Law enforcement would need to be contacted, families would need to be notified, and media attention would inevitably follow. The quiet retirement she had been looking forward to would be replaced by interviews, investigations, and the intense scrutiny that always accompanied high-profile cold cases. More troubling still was the realization that these documents might contain information that could implicate people who were still alive, still part of the community, still trusted and respected by those around them. If the children's observations were accurate, at least some of the perpetrators had possessed detailed knowledge about school procedures and individual students that suggested possible inside involvement or assistance. Margaret set down the manila papers and reached for the white drawing paper, knowing that whatever she found there would likely provide even more disturbing details about the children's final hours. But she also knew that she owed it to David, Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, and Lisa to hear their complete story, regardless of how difficult it might be to process or act upon. They had trusted that someone would eventually find their message and take it seriously, and she was determined to honor that trust, no matter what the personal cost might be. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the white drawing paper, the final piece of evidence that would complete the children's desperate attempt to document their fate. The paper was slightly thicker than standard school supplies, suggesting it had come from the art room where Lisa Murphy spent so many of her recesses creating the elaborate fairy tale illustrations that had made her teachers smile. As Margaret unfolded the sheet, she immediately recognized Lisa's distinctive artistic style in what appeared to be a detailed sketch of faces and figures. The drawing showed 5 adults rendered with surprising accuracy and detail for a child's artwork. Each face was carefully drawn with distinguishing features clearly marked: scars, glasses, facial hair, and other identifying characteristics that would be invaluable to law enforcement. Below each portrait, written in Lisa's neat printing, were additional details about height, clothing, and overheard names or fragments of conversation. One figure was labeled the boss, called everyone else stupid, while another was marked has limp on left side, drives the blue van. But what made Margaret's blood run cold was the 6th figure in the drawing, a face she recognized. The careful pencil strokes depicted someone she had known for decades, someone who had been part of the school community during that terrible time in 1979. The notation below this portrait, written in Lisa's innocent handwriting, read, "Mr. K from the cafeteria." He knew all our names and where we lived. Kenneth Morrison had been the head of food services at Millbrook Elementary for over 15 years when the children disappeared. Margaret remembered him as a quiet, efficient man who seemed to know every student's dietary restrictions and lunch preferences. He had access to student records, knew family information, and was trusted implicitly by parents and teachers alike. If Lisa's drawing was accurate, Kenneth Morrison had been providing inside information to the kidnappers, using his position of trust to facilitate the most heinous crime in their community's history. Margaret set down the drawing with shaking hands, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. Kenneth Morrison had retired shortly after the disappearance and had moved to Florida within a year, claiming he could no longer bear to work in a place that held such tragic memories. At the time, his departure had seemed like a natural response to trauma. Now it looked like the calculated escape of someone who knew he would eventually be discovered if he stayed. The final document was the small piece of spiral notebook paper, and Margaret could see immediately that it had been written by a different child entirely. The handwriting was Sarah Chen's precise, careful script that reflected her advanced academic abilities. But unlike the other documents, this one appeared to have been written in extreme haste, with several crossed-out words and corrections that suggested it had been composed under tremendous stress. Sarah's note was brief, but devastating in its clarity. "They're coming for us now. Mr. K told them we were asking questions and they know we saw them. David made us promise to leave this here even if we don't have time to hide it properly. The man with the scar said they've been watching us for weeks, and they know everything about our families. They said if we scream or try to run, they'll hurt our parents too. We're going to try to stay brave like David taught us. Please find us before it's too late." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she read Sarah's final words. These children had faced their worst nightmare with remarkable courage and intelligence, but they had also died knowing that the adults who should have protected them had failed them completely. Kenneth Morrison's betrayal was particularly heinous, because he had used his position of trust to deliver innocent children into the hands of predators. The weight of responsibility crashed down on Margaret like a physical force. She was holding evidence that could potentially solve the most notorious crime in her community's history. But she was also holding the last words of 5 children who had died because the adult world had failed to take their concerns seriously. The irony was devastating. The very documentation that proved their intelligence and courage also highlighted the complete failure of every system that should have kept them safe. Margaret knew without a doubt that she had to contact law enforcement immediately. The evidence she held was far too significant to keep to herself, and the families of the missing children deserved to finally know the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. But she also understood that revealing this information would destroy the quiet retirement she had been looking forward to and thrust her into the center of a media firestorm that would likely consume months or years of her remaining life. More troubling was the realization that Kenneth Morrison might still be alive somewhere in Florida, possibly living peacefully under the assumption that his crimes would never be discovered. If he was still alive, he would be in his 80s now. But that didn't diminish the need for justice or the importance of ensuring he faced consequences for his role in the children's deaths. The families deserved closure and other potential. Victims deserved protection. Margaret carefully gathered all the documents and placed them back in the envelope, handling each piece with the reverence due to evidence in a capital crime case. She understood that from this moment forward, these papers would need to be treated as crucial evidence in an active investigation, and she would need to ensure that the chain of custody was properly maintained to preserve their value in any potential prosecution. Walking to her kitchen telephone, Margaret dialed the number for the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Her hands were still shaking as she waited for someone to answer, but her voice was steady when the dispatcher came on the line. "This is Margaret Daniels," she said clearly. "I need to report that I've discovered evidence related to the disappearance of 5 children from Millbrook Elementary School in October 1979. I believe I have information that could solve the case." The response was immediate and intense. Within 30 minutes, Margaret's quiet home was filled with detectives, crime scene technicians, and federal agents who had been contacted due to the potential interstate nature of the crime. Lead Detective Patricia Ramirez, a 20-year veteran of the county's major crimes unit, handled the evidence with the same reverence Margaret had shown, carefully photographing each document before sealing them in protective containers. "Mrs. Daniels," Detective Ramirez said after reviewing the materials, "you've potentially provided us with the most significant break in this case since the children first disappeared. The level of detail in these documents is extraordinary, and if we can verify the information they contain, we may finally be able to bring closure to these families." The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed. Kenneth Morrison was located within 48 hours, living in a retirement community in Sarasota, Florida, under his own name. When confronted with the evidence from the children's documentation, he initially denied any involvement, but eventually provided a full confession when faced with the detailed accuracy of their observations. Morrison revealed that he had been recruited by a child trafficking ring that operated across multiple states, using his access to student records and his trusted position to identify potential victims and provide detailed intelligence about their routines and family situations. The 5 children had been targeted because they came from families with limited resources to fund extensive private investigations, and because their disappearance during normal school dismissal could be attributed to any number of explanations. The other members of the trafficking ring had died years earlier, but Morrison's confession provided law enforcement with information about additional crimes and helped identify the remains of several other missing children from different jurisdictions. The case that had begun with Margaret's discovery ultimately led to the resolution of multiple unsolved disappearances across the southeastern United States. Perhaps most importantly, Morrison led investigators to the location where the 5 children had been buried, providing their families with the closure they had sought for 4 decades. The funeral services for Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, Lisa, and David drew thousands of mourners, including Margaret, who was recognized by the families as the person whose dedication had finally brought their children home. Margaret's discovery proved that sometimes the most important evidence can remain hidden for decades, waiting for the right person to find it and have the courage to act. The children's remarkable documentation not only solved their own case, but also prevented other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. Their story reminds us that we should always take children's concerns seriously, no matter how unlikely they might seem, and that the truth has a way of eventually surfacing when people care enough to look for it. Sometimes the smallest discovery can change everything, and sometimes the voices of the innocent can still speak across the decades to demand justice. If this story has moved you, and you want to hear more incredible tales of ordinary people who made extraordinary discoveries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with others who believe that every voice deserves to be heard, no matter how long it takes for someone to listen.